Greetings, my most valued viewers, and verily welcome to Lost in Adaptation, the video-based verdict venture devoted to verifying variances between visual adaptations and the volumes they're validated by. Today we voyage once more into the visionary ventures of Venerable Alan Moore, the verbose British virtuoso of various graphic novels, to verify whether V for Vendetta vexed him any less than other vintage, valiant, yet ultimately in vain directorial visions. Hello my beautiful watchers. Interesting fact that my American audience might not be fully aware of, despite history choosing to make him the figurehead of the conspiracy, Guy Fawkes was not the mastermind behind the gunpowder plot. He was just the guy they sent to light the fuse. The real leader of the group was a bloke called Robert Catesby, a Catholic noble and Kit Harington's great times 18 grandfather. This tidbit has absolutely no relevance to the upcoming adaptation, but you see why I wanted to share it. Confession. I have always been mildly terrified of Alan Moore, and not just because he looks like he would laugh off being poisoned, shot and drowned. I think it's also because the dark, depressing, corrupt, hyper-capitalistic world that I've lived in my entire life has left me instinctively intimidated by a person who seems to be genuinely true to their convictions. And Moore has repeatedly demonstrated an iron-hard unwillingness to compromise his ideals in regards to his art. He's proven time and time again that he would rather refuse literal millions of dollars worth of royalties than have his name attached to anything he didn't 100% approve of. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Alan Moore, who like all of the coolest people hails from the United Kingdom, is widely regarded to be one of the most talented and influential writers in comic book history. By the way, I'm going to be using the term comic book and graphic novel pretty much interchangeably in this video. I know that bothers some people, but sorry. Moore began his career in the 1970s and spent the next 50 years or so bouncing back and forth between independent and mainstream publishing, as the stifling creative restrictions and fine print bullshit of the latter inevitably ticked him off sufficiently to tell them to shove it. During his stints in the mainstream, Moore contributed several iconic stories to DC's Superman, Batman and Swamp Thing amongst others, before creating his own dark parody of the superhero genre in the form of Watchmen. Another fun tidbit, apparently Moore didn't even know there was a Watchmen TV show until one of the creators tried to reach out to him by letter, and his response was basically, "I don't care, fuck off." These days, Moore has semi-retired from comic books and other high-profile projects, so he can devote more time to his dark magic. That's not a joke. Apparently he drunkenly decided to become a magician on his 40th birthday, and since then, the line between stage magic and actual occult practices has blurred to the point where he's now low-key worshipping an ancient snake god with nice hair. The weirdest thing is, I'm not even that surprised. If someone had asked me which of all of the authors that I'm aware of was the most likely to become an actual wizard, I probably would have picked Alan Moore. Anyways, David Lloyd seems like a nice guy, British artist. He met Moore while they were working for Marvel UK making Doctor Who comics, so they chose to collaborate when a new publisher called Warrior Magazine asked them to create an original pulp character for them in 1982. Together, they conceived V, the voracious vigilante with a vendetta fighting to bring down the fascist government of a dystopian future Britain. V's iconic Guy Fawkes mask was apparently all Lloyd's idea and design. Moore liked the concept so much he worked it into the storyline. As you probably know, this mask would go on to become an actual symbol of anti-authoritarian activism after it was adopted by multiple real-life protest groups and the cyber-anarchists known as Anonymous. Lloyd is apparently on board with this, though he has pointed out there's a certain level of irony in anti-establishment groups mass purchasing these masks, as it earns multi-billion-dollar corporations like Warner Bros. And Amazon an absolute fucking fortune in copyright and distribution fees. Anyways, V for Vendetta started life as a black and white serialization in said Warrior magazine. However, the company proved to be fatally financially unstable, going bankrupt long before V could complete his master plan to tear the yoke of fascist oppression from fair Britannia. However, a few years later he was resurrected by DC Comics, who picked up the publishing rights and funded both the completion of the story and remaking the existing chapters in color. Which sounds great, but this alliance would unfortunately sour some years later thanks to a sneaky clause in the contract. DC agreed that the rights to V for Vendetta would fully revert back to Moore and Lloyd as soon as it was out of print, then proceeded to keep it in print to this day. They are still printing new copies of this graphic novel, in part to screw over Alan Moore. DC had better hope that Alan doesn't fully master the dark arts, or he's going to put such a curse on them. So, because DC fully owned the comic, there was nothing more could do to stop it when producer Joel Silver teamed up with them and Warner Bros. To bring his book to screen. I'll admit to being a little conflicted about this. Big corporations screwing over artists is obviously a #bad thing, but I'm plagued with treacherous thoughts of how much I enjoyed this movie and am glad it got made. Silver certainly didn't fucking help matters by publicly claiming that Moore really liked the screenplay and was excited for the film, an apparently entirely fictitious quote that drove Moore to until then uncharted levels of apoplexy. Despite not owning the publishing rights, Moore would still have been entitled to a not insignificant amount of royalties and recognition from the film, but true to his before-mentioned convictions, he refused to accept any money or allow his name to be attached to the project in any way. David Lloyd quietly accepted the royalties, and yeah, fucking fair play. If I'm gonna get screwed, I might as well get paid is just as valid a philosophy as Moore rage-quitting the entire franchise. Credit where credit's due though, Moore never appears to resent his colleagues making their paper. In fact, both in this case and when they pulled a similar tomfuckery on him to make Watchmen, his only demand was they give his share of the money to his co-creators. Anyways, regardless of how the film got made it was, though word on the street is the first draft did not bode well for it as an adaptation. Writer Hilary Henkin apparently wanted to take the film in a more satirical direction, with more surreal elements and less ambiguity in regards to the plot and morals. It seems that the adaptation day was saved by the introduction of the Wachowski sisters, still riding the colossal wave of recognition the creation of the original Matrix movie earned them. Lana and Lily were actually fans of the graphic novel and had apparently been working on a possible screenplay as far back as the 90s. Their version was a lot closer to the original. It was by necessity condensed and intentionally modernized, but the intent was to preserve the themes of the novel. It looks like a lot of, yeah, I know a guy went into recruiting for this movie. The Wachowskis brought on James McTeague, the assistant director for all the Matrix movies, and gave him his first shot at the big boy director's chair. Then McTeague hired Natalie Portman because he'd worked with her on Star Wars Attack of the Clones. James Purefoy, most known for his role in HBO's Rome, was originally cast as V, but quit early on in the filming process, either because of scheduling conflicts or creative differences depending on who you ask. BT Dubs, if anyone knows where I can buy a replica of the coat that he wore in A Knight's Tale, please contact me. I've wanted to get in on that Prince Edward drip for years. After that, they went back to hiring people that they knew they could get on with and brought Hugo Weaving on board, which was a fucking excellent choice. He absolutely smashed it. Stephen Ray, John Hurt, Stephen Fry, and Tim Pigott-Smith also joined the film in other major roles. Filming mostly took place in London or on sound stages, though they nipped over to Berlin to film the fascist rally scenes, I guess to really drive home the imagery. Apparently the intention was to release the film in 2005, on the eve of the 400th anniversary of the failed gunpowder plot, but it got delayed to the relatively inauspicious March 2006. Despite this delay and Alan Moore's vocal disgust with the production, the film was extremely successful on release, both financially and for the most part critically. It didn't earn many awards, but it made a fortune in DVD sales, which was still a thing in those days, which I can remember very clearly because I'm very, very old. Of course, as we've seen time and time again on this show, success as a film does not necessarily mean it was loyal to its source material. So, let's talk adaptation. In a not-too-distant future, what used to be Great Britain has dealt with multiple global disasters by embracing a fascist government and all of the super fun thrills that come with that, like secret police, invasive surveillance, constant propaganda, and concentration camps for minority groups. A young woman named Evie is caught out on London's dark streets after curfew and almost assaulted by a roaming squad of Gestapo, only to be rescued by a mysterious, flamboyant, superpowered stranger in a Guy Fawkes mask who introduces himself as V. He invites her to join him on a nearby rooftop to witness the event that he was on his way to, and proceeds to pretend to conduct an orchestra as a bomb he planted in a former major London landmark goes off. He later brings her to his secret hideout, an underground complex filled with art and historical documents the government had attempted to erase. As part of V's mysterious master plan to overthrow said government, he takes out 3 high-ranking members of the ruling political party, a propaganda broadcaster, a bishop, and a doctor, all of whom are later revealed to have been involved in the management of a concentration camp that performed human experimentation and ended up giving V his enhanced abilities before it burned to the ground. Evie assists in the assassination of the bishop by masquerading as the underage sex worker that he ordered. Not sorry that V killed him. The Doctor is actually relieved when V comes to kill her, as she'd grown a conscience in the years since the crimes against humanity and mass murder she'd committed, and rather regretted the entire thing. V also temporarily takes over a TV propaganda studio to transmit his manifesto to the country, creating a cover for his escape by forcing the cast and crew into similar masks and cloaks. A rift eventually develops between V and Evie, and she makes an attempt to forge a path without him. However, she ends up getting black-bagged by what appears to be the secret police, locked up in a cell and interrogated. She manages to stay sane thanks to a message of hope and defiance that she finds written on toilet paper by a previous resident of the cell that describes her life as a lesbian actress who was eventually arrested and sent to the camps. Her resolve hardened by this example, Evie states that she would rather accept execution than collaborate with her captors, but in a rather shocking and controversial twist, it turns out the entire thing was V and a bunch of mannequins attempting to unlock her inner radicalist by recreating the traumatic events that did so for him. That's the last thing that's solidly loyal to the book, though if I word it vaguely, V succeeds in taking down the government but is mortally wounded in the process, and Evie puts his body on a bomb-packed secret train so he can have a Viking funeral in the following explosion. Running parallel to all this is the journey of Mr. Finch, a high-ranking police official and member of the ruling political party. While trying to uncover the identity of codename V, he ends up uncovering more about his own government sins than he's able to deal with and ends the story disillusioned with them. There's one particular example that I think really sets the tone for this adaptation. You know how the entire film builds up to the destruction of the Houses of Parliament, the fuse for Chekhov's powder barrel is lit right at the start, and they go out of their way to continuously remind the audience that it's not just a stunt or damage to the government's reputation, it's the symbol that V's entire revolution hinges on.
All V needs to do is keep his word. And then...
Well, that happened on the 6th page of the comic. He later blows up the Old Bailey, multiple other buildings, and Evie does indeed send his body up with the final bomb which took out 10 Downing Street. That's the official residence and office of the Prime Minister, but that place really held little significance to the evil new government of the novel. The thematic advantages of switching the order of these demolitions to make Parliament going boom, the climax of the film, are numerous. The country-shattering act of defiance the original gunpowder plot failed to achieve, suddenly seen through to its conclusion centuries later, seems like the painfully obvious thing to say for the grand finale. It was Guy Fawkes' whole thing. However, that logic only applies to the film, and to explain why, I need to get political, like deep political. Those guys who whine at me for being too political in videos have no grounds to complain this time, it's literally part of it. Okay, so V didn't need a grand inspiring symbol of revolution in the graphic novel because 1, he wasn't a revolutionary, he was an anarchist, and 2, he didn't destroy the government, he just gave it a little push into destroying itself sooner than it was going to do eventually anyway. Historically speaking, regardless of any ideals they claim to aspire to, fascism has always, when you get right down to it, been based entirely on individuals attempting to gain and hold onto as much personal power as possible. This sometimes provides at least the illusion of stability for a while, but inevitably ends up descending into infighting as everyone with a lick of power turns on everyone else as they try to advance themselves. Moore drew on this and made V's master plan to kill half the key members of the government himself and manipulate a situation where the rest assassinate each other at basically the same moment, leaving a power vacuum that no one person was powerful enough to fill. He basically doesn't do anything in the climax except allow himself to get shot. The dominoes he put in place were falling from the middle of the book onwards. There's a trace of this in the film. V talks a guy called Creedy into turning on his leader before they fight to the death in an epic battle, but the thing that really brings down the government is the power of the people, the movement he inspired to make the population of Britain rise up for truth, justice, and freedom. Again, thematically that is more satisfying. You have to love the idea that someone could topple an evil regime with a bulletproof idea and sick knife-throwing skills. And it feels more heroic and less unnecessary for V to receive his mortal wounds in a badass last stand, overcoming an entire squad of stormtroopers so he can snap the neck of the last remaining Nazi leader. But a slight side effect of this, and I think one of the reasons that Moore felt so angry about the film, is for all of this to be necessary to stop the fascists, it means that the fascist government had to be reasonably stable before V came along, and probably would have continued chugging along just fine without his intervention. It accidentally shows more respect for a fascist system than Moore intended or was willing to do. Going back to point 1, in November 2005, in an interview with Giant magazine, Moore claimed that the film had usurped his story about the battle between anarchy and the rise of 1980s British fascism, and made it about 2000s era American neoconservatism versus American liberalism. As mentioned, Moore is almost always intensely negative about any adaptation of his work with varying levels of justification, but yeah, he might have a point, even though he was a bit of a curmudgeonly dick about it. In the graphic novel, the government very clearly represents what Moore envisioned as the eventual outcome of Britain continuing its Thatcher-era descent into fascism, and V what he believed to be the political polar opposite, the embodiment of pure anarchy. Adding further nuance, while Moore makes his disgust with fascism deeply apparent, he doesn't fully endorse V's goals, despite them being way more in line with his own political leanings. V himself is fully aware that he's not fixing anything by blowing up half of London and manipulating the government into destroying itself. He's simply burning down the entire system and vaguely hoping that people will embrace self-governance in its absence. The work isn't even completed on his death. Evie has to take up the mantle and the Guy Fawkes mask to continue the fight. While Film V's plan is still based on sowing a certain amount of chaos, he's definitely presented as having a much clearer, heroic goal in mind. His ideology is recognizably more revolutionary than anarchistic. His aim is to destroy the current regime in order to restore Britain to a democracy, not just destroy it for the sake of destroying it. Lines like,
"People should not be afraid of their governments. Governments should be afraid of their people,"
were added to the film to make his crusade more palatable to a wider audience, along with him recruiting the entire population of London to join his cause by providing them with masks and cloaks. BT dubs, how the heck did V pull that off? I mean, he would have had to arrange mass production with a company with the resources to make hundreds of thousands of them, and either the revolutionary rhetoric or the capitalistic greed to not mention it to the government. Anyways, the influence of early 2000s American liberal anxieties is also clearly stamped all over the film's villains. The government's rise to power mirrors the novel up to a point. They took advantage of a slowly degrading world and a war that devastated huge parts of the earth but never quite made it to the UK. However, huge emphasis was put on how they solidified their control after a terrorist attack that was very obviously allegorical for 9/11, up to and including it being revealed that the party orchestrated it itself to spread enough fear in the population for them to willingly give up their rights for the promise of security. This change, probably more than any other in the film, is extremely debatable regarding if it's a bad, neutral, or actively good thing, assuming you're not Alan Moore. Yes, it is out of keeping with the original, and America's struggles with rising neoconservatism doesn't fit perfectly into the British setting. There suddenly being Berettas and Glocks everywhere just looks inescapably weird to my British eyes. You could, however, take the stance that fascism is fascism. It doesn't matter if it's Thatcher-inspired or Bush-inspired, it's bad, throw a knife at it. And you could go as far as to say that part of the reason the graphic novel made such an impact is because it was extremely relevant to the era. If the film had tried to replicate that with no updates whatsoever, it wouldn't have resonated with a modern audience. Okay, let's talk about some of the key characters. Putting his politics aside, V is more overtly charming and likable in the film. That he explicitly states that he cares for and even loved Evie is in stark contrast to the comic, in which it's very clear that he doesn't exactly see other people as people. This is noted by his jailers in the camp and reflected in things like his public broadcast. It's kind of hard to describe. He addresses humanity itself as if it were an unsatisfactory employee getting a dressing down by their boss. He chastises it for allowing the fascists to rise to power and makes some thinly veiled threats about punishing it if it doesn't get its act together. His goals, aside from spreading anarchy, are somewhat ambiguous, but he sure as fuck isn't doing it because he loves the people of Britain. He doesn't seem to even like them. This is entirely done done away with in the film, replaced with an inspiring call to action for the people to rise up with him and march in protest on the next 5th of November. While toning down V's psychopathic tendencies was probably a good idea overall, it makes his kidnapping and torturing of Evie a lot more shocking. It was honestly perfectly in keeping with his other behaviors in the novel, but seems wildly out of character for the guy who plays make-believe sword fights with a suit of armor and likes classic films. V being terribly burned in the fire that destroyed his concentration camp appears to be a film addition. No parts of his body are ever revealed in the graphic novel, and while Dr. Surridge says that her experiments altered him, on the day of his escape she described the flames as being behind him, not all around him. This is pretty minor, but it's mentioned in the comic that for V to have been in the camp at that time, it meant that he was probably part of a minority group, be it race, religious, or LGBTQ. I just hadn't considered that while watching the film. Natalie Portman's Evie is pretty much unrecognizable from her predecessor. Book Evie was a 16-year-old girl attempting to get into sex work who became immediately enamored with V as her savior and protector. She makes no attempt to leave V and is in fact abandoned by him when she gets too close to him emotionally. As hinted at the end of the comic, she takes over from V and dons the Guy Fawkes outfit, even kidnapping her own sidekick so the cycle can continue. In the film, instead of a lost, frightened girl happy to have what appears to be a safe home and hiding spot, she's now an overwhelmed but still defiant grown woman with a stable job in television, who V is forced to try to hold prisoner because of unfortunate circumstances, but escapes the first chance she gets. She's way more of the focus of the story now. The movie might have been about V, but it's told entirely from her perspective. When she's not with V, we often have no idea what he's up to. While she does pull the lever for V after his death, the story sort of implies that that's mission accomplished now, so there's no need for her to become the new V. The film version of her is more of an observer than a successor, an involved observer but still only there to witness V's cause, not inherit it. Mr. Finch, the head of the regular non-secret police force, follows the same general path as in the book, but he's somewhat a victim of the condensed story. In the film, he ends up being a master of facilitating exposition, but never really gets close enough to the main plot to play a pivotal role in it. His investigation into V leading him to uncover the government's orchestration of the 9/11-esque biological attack on the school made for a good subplot and gets the information to the audience, but it doesn't assist in the revolution because he doesn't release this information to the general public during the runtime of the film, and his attempts to track V down end in him arriving right after his death, so all he does is point his gun at Evie for a second then decide not to stop her. The graphic novel spent more time with this character and placed significantly more emphasis on his personal journey and growing disillusionment with the government that culminated in him taking a fuck ton of LSD in the ruins of a concentration camp where he hallucinates the events there and confronts the horror and guilt of his own participation in the fascist regime. His final big contribution to the plot was killing V. He stumbles onto him in the tunnels under London and fatally shoots him. It's made clear that this is an act of suicide on V's part, as he could have easily prevented it, but didn't feel the need to go on living now that his plans were being fulfilled. It's also clear that Finch doesn't fire at him because he sees V as an enemy of the state and doesn't see killing him as a victory, more a necessity, a tragic act to break the cycle of revenge that V was starting with his Vendetta. Gordon Detrich, Stephen Fry's character, is also entirely made over for the film. Originally, he was just a kind-hearted guy who took Evie in after V abandoned her and briefly became her lover before he stood up to the wrong mobsters and was murdered with a frickin' cutlass stabbed through his door. Amusingly, in the film, Fry appears to be basically playing himself, a homosexual TV show host with a flair for satirical comedy and a defiant streak regarding authority. The only difference is being forced to be closeted about his sexuality, and so far the real deal hasn't been executed by the government for mocking them. But yeah, it's basically what if Stephen Fry was in the dystopian future, and I don't hate it. Regarding Britain's homegrown Hitler fill-in, I have to admit the film went a little bit basic with this one. John Hurt gave a great performance, but they didn't take the character any further than yelling guy. All the associated imagery conveys everything you need to know about Chancellor Adam Sutler. His predecessor, Leader Adam Susan, is a bit more complex and a lot weirder. Okay, so something the film skipped over entirely is that the government in the comic had become completely dependent on AI, and not like an actual sapient computer, AI like the term is used now. Britain is basically being run by ChatGPT. A reminder that this was written in the 80s. It's pretty clear that Alan Moore has always been a dark wizard, he just didn't choose to tell us until recently. Anyways, Susan's mental health declines throughout the novel until towards the end it's pretty clear he's fallen in love with his cyber girlfriend, and the discovery that part of the reason that V has been so successful is because he'd hacked into it months before is treated like an infidelity by all parties. Right, let's round this off with a few minor differences that I personally found quite interesting. Film V chose the 1812 Overture by Tchaikovsky as the theme tune to his explosive destructions. Originally, he was associated with Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, possibly because, as is mentioned in the comic, the opening spells the letter V in Morse code. The fire at the concentration camp is left unexplained in the film, possibly just being an incredible twist of fate intent on setting V loose on the world. In the comic, it's made abundantly clear that he was absolutely personally responsible. As part of their experiments on him, the scientists had allowed V access to certain chemical materials to see what he'd do with them, and he'd sneakily collected enough of them to make everything he needed to blow the entire place to Kingdom Come. There's a pair of rather tragic characters called Derek and Rose Almond in the comic, or at least Rose is tragic, Derek's just kind of a prick. He was a high-ranking member of the secret police who let the stress of the job infect his home life and result in domestic abuse. He actually came quite close to stopping V early on in the story, but he forgot that he'd taken the bullets out of his gun to scare his wife with it earlier in the evening and earned himself an ignominious death. It turns out that, shockingly, fascists don't have great state support for widows, so Rose spends the rest of the comic in more and more desperate circumstances, having to sleep with powerful men that she finds disgusting and taking on a job as a showgirl in a seedy nightclub to stay alive. Aside from being a commentary on the uncaring nature of the system, Rose is quite significant to the story because she's the one who eventually kills Leader Susan. After the Fate AI computer is revealed to have been compromised, Susan attempts to regain some emotional stability by basking in what he expects to be the love and admiration of his adoring public, making an unscheduled public appearance with no protection, only to come face to face with a very done with his shit Rose Almond, who shoots him in the face without a moment's hesitation. This added another layer of nuance to the comic, as though V orchestrated some of the circumstances of this encounter, he couldn't possibly have planned for it exactly. He just knew that he could count on the fact that eventually people will always end up very done with fascist shit. Final thoughts. As much as I enjoyed it, I have to admit the film does not live up to Alan Moore's vision for the story. I think he would have felt that way regardless of how it turned out, but he's not wrong in this case. The graphic novel is inescapably deeper, smarter, more complex, and much more challenging to the reader. The huge disparity in length puts the film at a big disadvantage regarding developing more complex motivations for the leads and the background characters that ended up playing such a surprisingly pivotal role in the story. The political themes and messages, while not unrecognizable, are definitely blurred by the modernization and intercontinental influence. It is, however, somewhat difficult to be angry about this because, well, especially right now, the most valuable thing that V for Vendetta has to offer is the glimmer of hope it tells you to hold on to. Hope in the face of despair, hope in the face of what seems like overwhelming oppression. The film not only included that, it built on it. OSP Red once described V for Vendetta as the government from George Orwell's 1984 being overthrown by the Phantom of the Opera, and I don't think I've ever fully forgiven her for being that correct and funny in a single sentence. The influence of 1984 on V for Vendetta is obvious, but a key difference between them is 1984 is a cautionary tale that largely concludes that once you get to the setting of the novel, you're already pretty fucked, so just don't let it get to that point. V for Vendetta, on the other hand, depicts almost the exact same circumstance, but adds hope for the future. And cautionary tales are very important and helpful, until you realize just how close to the setting of the novel you've gotten these days, and then a message of not giving up on hope suddenly becomes a lot more useful. And obviously I'm not advocating that we just keep our fingers crossed for a literal knife-wielding superhero to pop up and save us. That's not the part of the story I'm talking about. I'm talking about more reminding us that history has proven time and time again that dictatorship inevitably crumbles from within if you can resist it long enough. I'm talking about the Wachowski sisters making it clear that if we all choose to become the hero, then there's fuck all that can be done to stop us. I'm talking about the part where people eventually stop eating the lies they're fed, no matter how accustomed they've become to the taste. So, whether it's regarding Thatcherism, post-9/11 jingoism, or what we're facing today, the most important message to take away from V for Vendetta is don't give up hope. And because the film remembered this, I'm personally just grateful for it right now.